March 27th, 1907, a 45-year-old woman named Mary Watson was cleaning her parlor in the small town of Wadesville, Indiana. She was standing on a step stool, and she was using a broom to sweep the cobwebs and the dust off the ceiling, and as she was doing that, she began to feel lightheaded. So immediately, she put the broom down and she climbed off the step stool, and she thought, she hadn't really had much to eat that morning, and so that must be why she was feeling dizzy. And so while she stood on the flat ground, waiting for this to pass, she reached over and she grabbed a biscuit and some coffee from the tray that her husband Zach had left for her before he had left for work that morning. Now, she didn't plan to rest here for too long, basically just until the dizziness cleared, and then she would get back to work because she had a lot of work still to do. She really wanted to have the house clean before Zach got back home. So Mary and Zach had only recently gotten married, just 5 months ago. And so they were still very much in the honeymoon phase of their relationship, where basically, everything was so great. They loved each other so much. Mary felt like she'd landed the perfect man. Zach was smart, he was charming, and he had a good job running the local post office. And most of the time, he was pretty upbeat and had a good sense of humor. However, just a few weeks ago, right around the beginning of March, that had changed. Zach had suddenly become really moody and quite distant. And when he got home from work, instead of chatting with Mary like he used to, he would go straight to his study and just sit alone for hours. But Mary didn't have to ask him what was bothering him because she knew. She knew that this time of the year was really hard for her husband because he had actually been married previously, twice actually, and both of his previous wives had died in March. And in fact, they died just 1 year apart from each other. So this month was just like a very tragic time for him. And these deaths were not like in the distant past. They were kind of recent. His first wife had died 2 years ago in March of 1905, and then his second wife had followed in March of 1906. So almost exactly 1 year ago to today's date, March of 1907. Now, Mary did think this was tragic, a horrible coincidence, But Mary's sisters, they found this pattern to be very suspicious, and they'd even tried to talk Mary out of going through with the wedding, asking if she really wanted to marry a man whose wives kept dropping dead. But Mary had brushed off their concerns because really deep down, she trusted him. She knew ultimately he really was a victim here of just terrible, unlucky coincidence. Now, the coroner had officially ruled that both of Zach's wives had died of sudden illnesses. And to some degree, to Mary's sisters, that only added to the suspicion. But to Mary, it seemed like it just sort of got rid of the suspicion of anything. How could Zach have had anything to do with his wives suddenly getting sick? It just didn't make any sense to her. However, despite firmly standing behind her husband here, what Mary did struggle with when it came to her husband's previous wives and this whole thing was that Zach clearly was still grieving his other wives. Like they were clearly on his mind, as they should be, and she understood that, but that was tough. But Mary had nowhere to put these feelings. She couldn't be mad at him. His first wife, Sarah, they had been together for 34 years before she died. That was a whole life before Mary, and she knew that. And then, the second wife, it is what it is. It was a short marriage, but she couldn't blame him for the situation she was in. It was just difficult. But sometimes, despite logically understanding the situation that she was in and doing her best to sort of emotionally contain it, Mary sometimes got this feeling that it was almost like she was living in somebody else's house, or like she was living in somebody else's life, specifically Sarah's life. Sarah was Zach's first wife. They'd been together for those 34 years. Ever since Mary had moved into this home with Zach, which is where Sarah had lived for all those years, Mary had been hesitant to do anything, to rearrange furniture or change the ugly green wallpaper that she really wanted to change in the parlor here, or get rid of any of the old-fashioned decor. It's like she knew that, that would be sort of bad for Zach potentially, that he would see that as, disrespectful to his first wife and to some degree his second wife. Mary just sort of felt like she was the third wheel in a sense. But as Mary stood in that parlor with the ugly green wallpaper, waiting for her headache and her dizziness to clear from when she had been cleaning the ceiling here, she's having those thoughts about how difficult her life was, but she reminded herself that, despite it all, she was Zach's wife now. No matter how she felt about it, those were the facts. She was his wife and he was her husband. And so, no matter how she felt about this house, the house was primarily her responsibility, and she was going to make sure that it was clean. So, after taking a final sip of coffee, Mary grabbed her broom, and she was about to climb back up on the stepladder to get back to cleaning the ceiling when she was hit with another really intense wave of nausea. She had to grab a table just to steady herself, and as she does, she feels this really intense, sharp cramp in her stomach that caused her to double over, and then before long, she collapsed to the ground right onto her knees, just writhing in pain. A few hours later, Mary's sister, Nancy, was standing outside of Mary and Zach's house, just absolutely breaking down, crying, just totally upset. And as she did this, she was watching as the undertaker loaded Mary's body into a horse-drawn wagon. Nancy couldn't believe how quickly this had all happened. I mean, she and Mary talked all the time. And that morning, Mary had sent a young neighbor over to Nancy's place to tell her that Mary said she was feeling sick and needed some help. But by the time Nancy arrived, it was too late. Mary was vomiting and she was convulsing, and by around 1 p.m., she was dead. And this was exactly what Nancy had feared would happen when Mary and Zach got married. She just hadn't imagined that it could possibly happen so quickly. So now, as the undertaker drove off with her sister's body inside, Nancy's gaze shifted to Zach, who was over on the porch talking to the town doctor. Zach had now lost 3 wives in 3 years, all in the same month too, like exactly a year apart. And Nancy, I mean, at this point, she was sure that he had to be responsible. Like, how else could this ever be possible unless he was doing something to these women? And Nancy, she was determined to prove it. The next day, Nancy and the rest of Mary's family walked with the town doctor and with Zach through Zach and Mary's home, looking for clues about what could have killed Mary. And all of them were just peppering Zach with questions about what each of his wives had been doing right before they died. And so far, Nancy wasn't hearing anything that made her think that Zach was innocent. According to Zach, there was 0 connection between the 3 deaths, except for the fact that they all happened in March. One of the wives had eaten a full breakfast before she died, and one had eaten nothing before she died. And Mary had actually only had some coffee and apparently a couple of bites of biscuits before she died. Zach also said that his first and second wives had been complaining of feeling sick for about 2 days before they ultimately succumbed and died. But Mary had been basically perfectly fine right up until she just suddenly died. Now, to Nancy, it seemed like Zach was trying way too hard to make it all just seem sort of random. She just didn't believe that there was literally no connection between all 3 deaths. I mean, how could that be? This is way too coincidental. And so Nancy was very happy to see that the town doctor was systematically gathering up different things from inside the house as they walked around, like silverware and various food items, basically anything that Mary might have put in her mouth or maybe touched, because he planned to get them all tested to see if maybe there was poison involved here. And so Nancy was glad that, like, Zach's saying one thing, but we're gonna actually test some stuff and see if that's really true. And so Nancy began following the doctor as he was scooping up all these different things, and eventually they found their way into the parlor, which is where Mary ultimately died. And when they were in the parlor, the doctor just abruptly stopped, and then he pointed to something in the middle of the room. And then he turned and looked at Nancy and the rest of the group who were also coming in, and he just said, "I know what happened." And Nancy was so caught off guard by this. I mean, she figured this was going to take some time to figure out this mystery. She looked past the doctor into the parlor to where he had been pointing, and she expected to see some kind of like obvious clue, but to her confusion, there was just a step stool and then a dusty old broom. That was all he pointed to, and she couldn't understand what he was talking about. So it would turn out that the 3 wives actually did have something in common when it came to their untimely deaths. So in the early 1900s, the month of March was the time for spring cleaning. And spring cleaning was what all of Zach's wives had been doing right before they died. Specifically, all of them had been cleaning the parlor, which had that ugly green wallpaper in it. But this wallpaper was not just ugly. It also contained a toxic substance known as arsenic. And when Mary and both of Zach's other wives dusted with the broom, it kicked up a cloud of deadly particles that they all inhaled. And so the town doctor had the wallpaper tested, and he would confirm that all 3 women had died of poisoning. Except the culprit was not Zach, it was the wallpaper. A few weeks later, Zach would have that wallpaper torn down, and then he married a 4th wife, but this time, she outlived him. Minimum payments are not designed to get people out of debt. They're designed to keep them stuck. That's why so many people are turning to PDS debt for a real solution. PDS debt can reduce up to half of what's owed on credit cards, personal loans, and even medical bills. The process starts with a free 30-second assessment at pdsdebt.com/MrBallen. PDS uses AI and data to go beyond the numbers and personalize saving solutions for each person's situation. Instead of juggling multiple payments every month, PDS debt can help combine them into one lower monthly payment, and savings can start the same day the 30-second assessment is completed. If there's a balance sitting on credit cards right now, interest charges are adding up every single day. PDS debt offers a way to finally take control, and there's no minimum credit score required. PDS debt is one of the top-rated companies in the industry, with thousands of 5-star reviews and an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. Get your free 30-second personalized assessment today at pdsdebt.com/MrBallen. One morning in the spring of 1885, a young man named Henry Ziegland was leading a horse around his family's farm in Driner Township, Minnesota. The horse was recovering from a minor hoof injury, and now Henry was taking it for a walk to give it some light exercise and get a sense of how it was actually doing. And Henry was in an unusually good mood. He was enjoying the warm breeze, and he also just had this great feeling that he had his whole life ahead of him, which was really not a feeling that Henry was used to at all. So until recently, Henry had been engaged to a young woman named Maisie Tickner. Henry had started talking to her 5 years ago when they were both in their early 20s, and their initial romance had been great. They'd fallen for each other really quickly, and they'd actually moved in together really quickly, even though back then that kind of thing was definitely frowned upon unless you were married, but they're like, don't worry, we're gonna get married, it's okay. And so people were like, I don't know, but they were like, it doesn't matter. We're gonna get married, it's all gonna be good. Except the wedding had never really materialized. Now, Henry hadn't planned to break his promise to Maisie, but first he'd just been busy with his farming. And then Maisie had taken a new teaching job. And since they were already living together, Henry hadn't seen what the difference would be if they got married anyways. It just sort of seemed like, what's the big rush? But as the years went by and they continued not to get married, Maisie began pestering Henry more and more about just setting a date so they could finally get married and stop living this sort of scandalous life. And for Henry, he understood why she was doing this, but the more she asked, the more he sort of began to think, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to marry her. I don't know if this is a good idea at all for me. And then finally, just a few days ago, Maisie had sat Henry down in their kitchen and had given him an ultimatum. He could either marry her like he had promised, or they were done. And in that moment, Henry had sort of realized that ending this relationship was exactly what he wanted. So that day, he was like, okay, I guess we're done. He packed his things, and he moved into his family's farm. And Maisie had been sort of caught off guard by this, because as much as she's the one positioning the ultimatum, acting like she's prepared to walk away too, in reality, she wasn't. She really wanted to get married. That's what she wanted. She was just trying to force him to finally do it. And so when he was like, okay, bye, we're over, it's like she tried to stop him, but then she began saying, like, you're ruining my life. Like, you're ruining my life, not your life, my life. So a broken engagement, after having lived together and shared the same bed for years at a time, and then never getting married, that was a very bad situation for both parties, but at the time, it was far worse, socially, let's say, for the woman than it was for the man. And so in Maisie's mind, and I'm sure Henry understood this too, but for Maisie, it's sort of like, Henry, if you walk out on me right now, no one's gonna want me. Like, my life will be ruined, and yours won't be. Like, you're the guy. You're gonna be able to go on and get married, and I won't be able to. But Henry didn't really care, and he left. And now, after a few days since the separation, Henry, despite logically knowing that he clearly had put Maisie in a very bad position, he knew that, but he knew internally as well he had made the right decision. Because right now, he felt great. He felt free for the first time in a long time. And so he did what he had to do. And so Henry finished his laps with the horse, and then he walked it over to the watering trough, which was underneath this big oak tree near the barn. And he had just tied the horse to that oak tree to let it drink when he heard someone shouting his name. Henry spun around, and he saw a man stalking toward him from across the field. And the man was Maisie's older brother, Filford. And his face was bright red, and he was glaring at Henry like he meant to kill him here. Which Henry realized was a very real possibility, considering what Henry had just done to Filford's sister. And then on top of that, as Henry's sort of taking this all in, he sees that Filford doesn't just look mad. He's also carrying a rifle, this old-fashioned rifle. And when Henry saw the gun, he immediately panicked and he turned to run away, but the huge oak tree was in his way. He sort of bounced off the tree and he turned back around. And by this point, Filford had closed the distance, and there was clearly nowhere where Henry could reasonably run without still clearly being in range of Filford's weapon. And so Henry, not knowing what else to do, just dropped to his knees and threw his hands up and begged Filford for mercy, telling him, you don't understand, we had to break up. I would never want to hurt Maisie on purpose. You got to believe me. She wouldn't want you to do this. You got to spare me. She loved me. Let it go. And for a moment, Henry felt like maybe he'd gotten through to Filford and he wasn't going to get shot here. Filford, who by this point was only a few feet away from Henry, he was still gripping his gun, just glaring at Henry. And there was this moment of just really intense silence. And then he said something that made Henry's stomach drop. He told him that he would have no way of knowing what Maisie would have wanted to do here with Henry, because earlier that very morning, his sister had taken her own life. And then Filford, he raised his rifle and he fired. Pain immediately exploded in Henry's head, and he felt himself get literally thrown backwards really hard. And he bounced off the oak tree and fell to the ground, expecting at any point for everything to just go black forever, to just die and be done with it. But after a few seconds, he realized he wasn't dead. His head was pounding from where he had just been shot, and he could feel blood running into his eyes and all over his whole body. So clearly he knows he's been shot, but somehow he's still conscious. And then he heard the sound of Filford reloading his rifle. Henry considered trying to get up and making a run for it, but it was what chance did he really stand here? He's already been shot once. The guy's clearly willing to shoot him. He's reloading. He's right in front of him. How far can he possibly get before he gets shot again? So instead, he just lay still and prayed that maybe Filford would think he was dead and not shoot him again. And so Henry's heart hammered in his chest as he listened to the sounds, the mechanical sounds of Filford reloading this rifle. And this was a painfully slow process because Filford's gun was an old army musket from the Civil War. So he's packing gunpowder and a lead pellet into the barrel of this gun. This is a lengthy reloading process. And this whole time, Henry, as he's listening to this, he's just holding his breath, trying to be still. But at the same time, he's getting more and more certain that he was about to die. There was no way he was not about to get shot again. What else could Filford be doing? Finally, Henry heard the metal click of the gun cocking, which meant that it was now loaded. And so Henry, trying his best still not to move, he still tensed up a little bit, bracing for the impact. And then there was this deafening bang, just like the first one. As soon as he heard it, Henry flinched. But he didn't feel anything. Instead, he just heard a thump and then silence. He waited a few more seconds, and then he opened one eye, and Filford was lying a few feet away, bleeding profusely from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot to his head. Despite being shot in the head, Henry would survive this attempt on his life, and Filford would die from the self-inflicted gunshot wound. Now, Henry did understand that, by breaking up with Maisie, it had very likely led to her taking her life, and it almost got him killed, and it definitely led to Filford taking his life. There's a lot of death and tragedy here because of something that, Henry largely did. But he didn't feel any guilt after he ultimately survived this attempt on his life. The way he rationalized it was he thought that Maisie and Filford were just both very weak. I mean, Maisie, instead of trying to move on and rebuild like a strong person, she had been weak and she had taken the easy way out. And Filford, he had one shot, point blank. He could have shot and killed Henry and gotten his justice, but he missed, and then he took the easy way out. He took his own life instead of facing consequences. And so Henry just felt like, screw those people. And after that day that he was attacked by Filford, it was like his luck just seemed to get better and better. His head wound really had been superficial and it healed quickly. And soon after he was fully recovered, he married a wealthy widow. And with her money, his farm grew, and he eventually became one of the richest men in the whole area. And as the years went by, his thoughts about Maisie and Filford just kind of faded into the background, until everything that happened just sort of felt like a distant memory from an entirely different life. That is, until 20 years later, on March 21st, 1905. On this morning, Henry was cutting down some old dying trees on his property with his teenage son. Now, at this point, Henry had plenty of farmhands, so he didn't have to do this kind of job himself. But he liked showing his son how things were done, so this was like a teaching moment. Now, so far that day, they'd been working their way through some of these smaller trees that needed to get removed. But the last one, the big oak tree near the barn, had wood that was so hard that their saws could not cut through it. So Henry explained to his son what you do in this type of situation, which is you get some dynamite and you literally blow the tree up. And Henry had some dynamite just for this occasion, and he grabbed it and he walked over to this oak tree and he jammed it inside of the hollow of the trunk. He told his son to get back, and then he lit the fuse, and then he hustled back with his son, and they hid behind shelter, and they watched and they waited. And after a few seconds, the fuse burned all the way into the dynamite, and then it exploded. 20 years earlier, when Henry was shot in the head by Filford and narrowly survived, well, that bullet that hit him, it literally ricocheted off his skull and lodged in the oak tree right behind him. Like it just basically bounced off his head. And that bullet remained lodged in that oak tree for the 20 years after. And then comes the day that Henry decides he wants to take this tree down and he can't cut it down. So what does he do? He puts dynamite inside and he decides he's going to blow it up. And after lighting the fuse, he and his son, they go all the way. On the evening of November 22nd, 2018, a middle-aged woman named Mandy was sitting in her living room at her home in a coastal town in southern England, reading a book while the TV played as background noise. And as she was sitting there, she heard the distinctive sound of footsteps kind of shuffling down the stairs. And Mandy looked up and she watched as her wife, Lena, came stumbling down the stairs, and in her hand was her favorite cup, which was a mason jar with a metal straw in it. And Mandy watched as Lena stumbled her way into the living room and then began, stumbling over towards the kitchen. And as she did this, Mandy just kind of cringed, because Mandy knew what Lena was about to do. And sure enough, just a moment later, when Lena had made her way into the kitchen, sort of out of sight, Mandy heard the sound of the refrigerator door opening up, and then the distinctive sound of liquid being poured into a cup, as Lena made herself another cocktail of vodka and orange juice. So Mandy had married Lena 4 years ago, and for that entire time, Lena had been a drinker. But Mandy always tried hard not to harp too much on Lena for drinking too much to kill her. One evening in November of 1972, a 68-year-old man named Demetrius Machura hurried around his small room at a boarding house in Stoke-on-Trent, England, pouring salt all over the floor. And as he did this, he looked out the window and saw the fading daylight and knew he had to hurry. However, running around like this was really taxing, especially on his lungs, because for decades he had worked in this very dusty pottery factory and it had really taken a toll on him. So moving faster was really hard to do. But he really needed to push through the pain and the discomfort and finish what he was doing before it got dark out. Because when it got dark out, that's when the vampires came out. So Demetrius had immigrated from Poland about 25 years earlier. And in his home country, vampires were not just, lore, but actually they were a huge part of the culture and were often spoken about as being very real dangers that people should be scared of. And recently, Demetrius, despite now living in England, of course, he had begun hearing about a lot of vampire sightings here. A few years ago, he started noticing these news reports about a vampire that was living in London's Highgate Cemetery. And also around the same time he began seeing those reports, he also learned about these two girls who had been attacked by a vampire in the English countryside. And Demetrius, he just could not believe how people were just not that panicked about this. I mean, Demetrius was terrified. He had grown up being scared of vampires that obviously, played a role in his reaction to these sightings now in England. But still, he's thinking like, why aren't more people scared about this? But even more than that, when Demetrius would actually talk about, these vampire concerns that he had with people in England, he found most people thought it was fake. That they thought that, these news reports and, all that stuff, it was just made up. It was fake. And then they would kind of look at Demetrius as sort of like an idiot for thinking that that was real. Like, come on, vampires aren't real. But to Demetrius, he just felt like, you know what? Those people who don't believe in this very real threat that obviously is getting worse here, those people, they're the idiots, not him. And so Demetrius, instead of, trying to defend his position or try to convince anyone to believe what he believed, he decided to just do what he had to do to protect himself. And he knew exactly what to do. So Demetrius, he had a whole routine of things he would do to protect himself from vampires when he was living in Poland, and mostly he had abandoned that routine when he came to England. But now, since these sightings, he had brought back that routine, and it was very extensive. He had added on to it, made it more elaborate, but it was something he now did every single night, because vampires only come out at night, and so that's when you need protection. So before Demetrius climbed in bed at night, he would pour salt all around the room, and he would also scatter fresh garlic cloves everywhere, since those were both very toxic to vampires. And then after that, he would go up to each of the crosses that he had on his wall to make sure they were properly secured, because crosses are known deterrents to vampires. And then typically, after checking all the crucifixes, he would go around and maybe do a little more salt, a few more garlic cloves, and then once everything was in place and secure, he would climb into bed. And the moment his head hit the pillow, he would feel his heart rate finally start to settle down, because he knew that, at least for this night, he would be safe. And so in November of 1972, Demetrius just continued every night doing his vampire protection procedure. And even though some people thought this was very strange and very paranoid of him because, vampires aren't real, right? Well, it wasn't hurting anyone. Demetrius felt better when he did it. It was just sort of his own thing, and so he just continued to do it, and it didn't cause any problems. Until November 24th of that year. So on that day, just before 10 p.m., Police Constable John Pye of the Stoke-on-Trent Police Department, he walked up to the entrance of Demetrius's boarding house. He was here to do a wellness check because the landlady of this place had called the station to tell them that she hadn't seen one of her tenants, Demetrius Machura, in about a week and was starting to worry about him. So now Pye knocked on the front door, and a few seconds later, this older woman swung it open and she introduced herself as the landlady, and then she let Pye inside and led him down a hallway and stopped in front of Demetrius's door. And so Pye knocked and he called out to Demetrius, announcing that he was the police and he was just here to make sure he was okay. But there was no sound coming from inside the room. And then when Pye reached down and tried the handle, he found it was locked. And so after knocking a few more times and calling out and still not hearing anything from inside, Pye told the landlady to go ahead and step back because he was going to knock this door down. So Pye, he leaned back and then rammed his shoulder against the door, and actually it swung open really quickly, and immediately Pye and the landlady were hit with this really strong smell of garlic that was coming out of the very dark room in front of them. And so Pye immediately yells into the room for Demetrius, but there's no response. And so Pye, he reaches in and tries to find a light switch, and he does, and he flips it on, but it wasn't working for some reason. So Pye, he pulled out his flashlight off his belt, he clicked it on, and then he walked into the room. And right away, Pye felt like this small, dark room was the most bizarre, creepy space he had ever been inside of. There was what appeared to be salt all over the floor. And there were also cloves of garlic, like everywhere, not just on the ground, but also up on windowsills. And then at some point, Pi swept his flashlight from the wall over to the bed in the back of this room. It's basically like a one-bedroom apartment. And he sees the bed, and he sees there was a definitive human-sized lump under the sheets. And so right away, he had a good sense of what it was. And so Pi, he walked across the floor, stepping on garlic and salt as he went. And when he reached the bed, he pulled back the sheets, and under the sheets was the very obviously dead body of Demetrius Matura. Pi heard the sound of the landlady who had followed him inside by this point. She gasped because she's seeing, what's inside of her boarding house here. And at this point, even though Pi was very sure Demetrius was dead, just to be sure, he reached down and he felt for a pulse, but there was none. And also Demetrius's skin was very cold and very pale. However, despite how very obviously deceased Demetrius was, Pi looked around and couldn't really make sense of exactly how he had died. I mean, there was no denying that he was in a very strange location, but he couldn't really picture how the salt and the garlic and the crosses could have had anything to do with his death. Maybe it was just the insanity of a dying man who crawled into bed and he died in here or something, but it was like, there's no visible wounds, there's no blood anywhere, there's nothing. It's just this weird, creepy room this guy's in, and he's just dead under the sheets. It was just bizarre. But there was one thing about Demetrius that in Pi's mind was pretty disturbing. I mean, even more so than what he was already seeing. And that was that Demetrius, he had died with this terrified looking expression on his face. Like his mouth was wide open, like it was frozen as if he'd been screaming as he took his final breath, which made Demetrius wonder if maybe when he died, his death had been quite painful or just terrifying. Like maybe Demetrius had seen something, like as he died. Was he scared of something as he was dying that caused his face to sort of freeze in this expression? However, that made Pi think that maybe this was a homicide. That the victim, Demetrius, was scared of the attacker, and that's why he looked the way he did. The attacker is attacking him, and he's reacting. But Pi's looking at the body thinking, I don't think this was a homicide, because there's just no injury anywhere. So what would the attacker have done? How could they have forcibly killed Demetrius without leaving any marks anywhere? Now, Pi knew he was not going to get any real answers here without an autopsy, but while he was here, he could at least do a search of the room and also canvass the neighbors, starting with the landlady. So he turned to the visibly shocked landlady and asked her, hey, what's the deal with all the salt and the crosses and the garlic? What's that about? And surprisingly, she shrugged it off it was just no big deal. It's just what Demetrius did. And when Pi was like, what do you mean? She explained that Demetrius had a really serious phobia of vampires, and these were measures he took to protect himself from vampires. For a second, Pi just stared back at her, like he couldn't believe what he was being told. But then he was also thinking all right, I'm looking around the room. This is already totally weird. So actually, in a way, that sort of tracks. However, Pi wasn't sure if Demetrius's apparent delusion around vampires really had anything to do with Demetrius's death or not, or if this is just a quirk of the case that this man died, however he died, and also was scared of vampires. He didn't know. But for now, Pi was just incredibly curious and absolutely determined to get answers. A little over a month later, Police Constable Pi was sitting at his desk in police headquarters reading a library book about vampires. So Demetrius's case was actually on pause while Pi waited for the autopsy results. But even though he really couldn't do much until those results came in, Pi himself just couldn't stop thinking about Demetrius's creepy room and all his vampire stuff. And so, on his own, Pi had become a little bit obsessed. Now, there was a possibility that Demetrius had simply died from some illness in his sleep. Pi had learned that Demetrius had actually been sick a lot before he died, and that he'd worked in a pottery factory that really affected his lungs. So Pi knew that it was entirely possible that Demetrius had some form of potter's rot, which was a lung disease that a lot of pottery workers got from the bad air in the factory. But potter's rot was like this slow-moving, sort of compounding sickness. It was very progressive, but over a long period of time. And Demetrius apparently had died suddenly. And Pi had spoken to all of Demetrius's neighbors, and they all said, in the time leading up to his death, he wasn't showing any obvious sign of getting sick, or getting sicker, I should say. Like, there was no progression happening. He seemed normal and then was just dead. So that sort of confirmed that potter's rot seemed unlikely. Additionally, when Pi spoke to the neighbors, they also communicated that it didn't seem like Demetrius had any obvious enemies. So the idea that there had been some kind of invisible foul play like poisoning also didn't really make sense. And so without any other theories to work on, and without the autopsy results yet, Pi had been doing a lot of research on vampires. Now, he was certainly not about to consider that a vampire had killed Demetrius, but the scene of Demetrius's death was just so weird that Pi couldn't get past the feeling that somehow vampires must have had something to do with his death. So far, though, his research really hadn't helped clear that up. But just then, Pi's phone rang, and when he answered it, his heart began to race because it was the coroner. And the coroner said the autopsy was done. And the coroner told Pi that he was never going to believe what that autopsy had discovered. It would turn out Pi had been right. Vampires had everything to do with this death. On the night that Demetrius died, he had done all the things he usually did to keep himself safe before he climbed in bed. But unlike the other nights when he had done this procedure, this night, his routine had not worked. So Demetrius, along with spreading salt all over his room, also put garlic cloves everywhere, since that was one of the most famous ways to ward off vampires, and so he did it every single night. And one of the places, in addition to the floor and the windowsills, that Demetrius would put these cloves at night, one of those places was his own mouth. And he'd become really good at keeping that garlic clove under his tongue while he was asleep. But on that night in November, something went wrong. While he slept, the clove slipped out from under his tongue, went down his throat, and got stuck. And during the autopsy, the coroner literally found the clove still stuck there. And so it was determined that he had died from choking on it. So, while garlic cloves may have played a role in protecting Demetrius from vampires, unfortunately, it was literally the clove itself that killed him. One fall afternoon in the late 9th century, a Viking leader named Sigurd Eysteinsson rode his horse across this large field in northeastern Scotland. Riding on either side of him were two of his commanders, and behind the three of them was Sigurd's entire army. This field they were traveling across was about to become a battlefield, and Sigurd and his commanders were riding out to meet the leader of the opposing army who would be taking part in this battle, a horrible buck-toothed man named Mile Brigta. And Mile was actually already in place at the meeting spot, right in the middle of this battlefield. And he was on his horse, and he was flanked on either side by two commanders as well. And then, well behind him was his sea of warriors that would be taking part in this battle. So Mile, he ruled a kingdom called Murray, which was a large area in the north of Scotland. And Sigurd wanted to conquer it. And so today, Sigurd and Mile were meeting in the middle of this really potential battlefield with their respective armies waiting in the wings, behind them. And the idea is they would try to negotiate. Effectively, Sigurd would, basically tell Mile, give me some percentage of your land and we won't, raid your area and try to conquer you. And it was sort of on Mile to determine if that was a worthy thing or not, or if it was better to just stand your ground and fight. Sigurd was not worried because he knew that ultimately he was going to win that fight. Not only did Sigurd's Viking army vastly outnumber the Murray, but Sigurd himself was just far more accomplished on the battlefield than Mile. Sigurd was actually known as Sigurd the Mighty, and he was this famous, fearsome warrior who'd spent the last 2 decades ruthlessly conquering parts of Scotland for his king back in Norway. Mile, on the other hand, was not really feared or respected like that, certainly not by Sigurd. Mile was really known just to be sort of impulsive and kind of untrustworthy, and also definitely kind of dumb. And now, as Sigurd and his commanders arrived in the middle of the field, right in front of Mile and his two commanders, and they brought their horses to a halt, Sigurd could now see with his own two eyes another thing about Mile that he actually was known for, he was famous for, and that was his two giant front teeth that stuck out way over his bottom lip, and actually had earned him a nickname of sorts, which was Mile the Buck-Toothed. And so not long after Sigurd arrived, Sigurd and Mile and the other commanders began their negotiation. But Sigurd quickly realized that Mile was not there to make concessions in order to, find a path to peace. He was actually trying to make demands of the Vikings. Like, he was there telling the Vikings what to do, which is just, in Sigurd's mind, totally ridiculous. I mean, you're outnumbered, you're outclassed, like, what are you doing? In fact, Sigurd, couldn't believe what was even happening. I mean, as far as he was concerned, Mile was just a nobody, and his demands in some ways were just disrespectful, not real demands. If Mile was smart, he would be begging for mercy here, but obviously he was not smart. And so Sigurd quickly realized that what would have to happen here is he and his Vikings would have to just slaughter his army and seize his lands. And so at some point, while Mile was literally mid-sentence, making whatever demand he was making, Sigurd turned to his two commanders and just gave the signal that they were not doing this. They were going to have to fight here. And so Sigurd just grabbed the horse's reins, turned around, and he and his commanders galloped back to his army. And as soon as they got there, Sigurd told his men that they were going to have to massacre all the Murray. But they needed to save Mile the Buck-Toothed for him. Hours later, Sigurd was still on his horse, but this time he was leading what remained of his victorious Viking army down this dirt road away from the battlefield and back towards their camp. Sigurd, like basically all of his men, was totally exhausted, but he was also full of adrenaline because the battle was over and it had gone exactly the way he knew it would. His soldiers had completely destroyed Mile and his army, and he, Sigurd, had personally killed Mile. And so now, as Sigurd rode along here, he looked down at Mile's severed head, which he himself had removed from his adversary's body, and then he had attached the head to his saddle. He looked down at the head, and the head's dangling near his legs, and Mile's eyes are wide open and looking vacantly up at Sigurd, and his mouth was wide open as well, which only sort of made his front teeth look even bigger and hang out even more. And as Sigurd gazed down at this head, he couldn't help but smile as a wave of just pure satisfaction washed over him. During their pre-battle negotiations, Mile had just been unbearably annoying and sort of offensive. And so Sigurd was thrilled he'd gotten the best of him and now had his head dangling right near his legs. That is just perfect for Sigurd. And now that Mile the Buck-Toothed was dead, Sigurd was one step closer to conquering all of Scotland. So he gave out this loud, triumphant war cry, and his men answered him with cheers. Then Sigurd spurred his horse into a full gallop. However, just a few days later, everything had changed for Sigurd. By this point, Sigurd was now laying under a wool blanket in this stone shack in one of his Scottish settlements, and he was screaming in pain. Because over the last couple of days, he'd gotten incredibly sick, and now he was delirious, and he had such a bad fever that he was both covered in sweat and also shivering nonstop. And then at some point, the doctor who had been taking care of Sigurd came into the shack to check on him, and after looking him over, the doctor just shook his head and told Sigurd that he had done all he could, but this sickness, whatever it was going to kill him. And Sigurd, when he heard this, he felt nothing but rage. Not because he was dying, but because he knew that he'd actually been very wrong. He had not gotten the best of Mile the Buck-Toothed. Mile the Buck-Toothed had clearly gotten the best of him. So it would turn out, after the big battle, after, Sigurd had won so triumphantly, as he was riding along, carrying along with him the head of his adversary, Mile's severed head, well, as he began galloping faster and faster, and he's cheering for his men, they're so triumphant, and everyone's cheering along. As he's going faster and faster, the severed head, began bouncing, because of the movement. And remember, Mile's got those big two front teeth. He's got a nickname, Mile the Buck-Toothed, for a reason. Well, those teeth, as the head jostled around, began puncturing Sigurd's thigh. And he didn't notice it because he was so jacked up on adrenaline. He's galloping off, he's looking down, he sees blood all over his legs, and he's thinking it's gotta be Miles' blood from the fact that his head's been cut off. But no, it was actually Sigurd's blood from the punctures from Miles' buck teeth. And so in the end, even though Sigurd did, successfully kill Mile, he won the battle, well, it would turn out that Mile wasn't done with Sigurd, because Mile ultimately caused Sigurd's death because those punctures got horribly infected. There was no antibiotics to cure the infection, and ultimately Sigurd died. Around 2 p.m. on July 11, 1978, a man named Francisco Imbernon-Valena drove down a highway a few miles outside of the coastal town of La Rapita, Spain. Earlier, Francisco had left the warehouse where he worked, and he was now driving back toward the city where he lived. And so far, this drive had been very uncomfortable and sweaty since it was really hot out today, and he didn't have air conditioning. And also, he was just very annoyed. Because before he had left the warehouse, he'd gotten into a disagreement with another employee. So Francisco was in his 50s, and he had been doing his job for years. And while for sure he was a bit of a curmudgeon about certain things, he was also really experienced and self-sufficient. But for some reason, this other younger guy, this coworker of his who worked in a completely different department, had felt the need to micromanage him and start telling Francisco how to do his job. And he'd even had the audacity to tell Francisco that if he didn't listen to him, listen to this criticism and change your behavior, if you don't do that, you're gonna regret it. Needless to say, Francisco did not appreciate being told how to do his job, especially by some young idiot here. And so in the moment, during their confrontation, Francisco had simply ignored the other employee and kept doing his work. But in reality, the whole thing had really bothered him. And even now, as he drove down the highway, it was all he was thinking about. He was just totally stewing over what this guy told him. Up ahead, Francisco noticed a sign that said a few toll booths were coming up. And now Francisco felt a whole new wave of irritation about these stupid tolls. He thought they were a complete ripoff. And so he made a point to never pay them if he could help it. And luckily for Francisco, on this particular route, he did know a way around these tolls. It was a back route that did take a bit longer, but it saved him money. Plus, it ran right by the ocean, so it was very scenic. And so at the next exit, he pulled off the highway and began taking this long cut. About half an hour later, around 2:30 p.m., Francisco drove down a narrow road that ran right along the ocean. And as he did this, Francisco, if this was even possible by this point, felt even more annoyed. He had been hoping by the time he got down here that there would be some kind of sea breeze to cool him down because there was no AC in the truck. But it was somehow, despite being near the ocean here, it was somehow even hotter than when he had been out on the highway. Just up ahead, there was this very popular campground called Los Alfaques. It was this expansive field right next to the beach that was full of camper vans and tents, and there were also a few businesses like restaurants and a general store that served the grounds. And Francisco saw that this afternoon, the area was absolutely packed. There were hundreds of people just hanging around their campsites and swimming in the ocean. And as Francisco drove past, all he began to think is how great it would be if he could just pull over for a second and take a plunge in the water himself and actually cool off. And so he was letting his mind wander, sort of wishing this ride was less miserable than it had been so far, when an odd sound caught his attention. It was like this metallic groaning sound. And at first, he couldn't even place it. Like he had no idea what it was, and pretty quickly the sound went away. So he just continued driving along, and then he heard it again. Except this time it was much louder. And this time, Francisco did know what it was, but it was already too late. Just seconds later, people in towns miles away from the campground where Francisco was passing by heard this deafening boom. And from all directions, everyone turned towards Los Alfaques just in time to see this enormous fireball rise into the air like a huge mushroom cloud. It looked like a bomb had literally gone off. But before anybody could make sense of this, there was another explosion, and then another and another. It was like this rapid-fire chain of blasts that boomed over the campground one after another for several minutes. And then finally, when it all went quiet, it was just like flames and smoke and ash just soaring into the sky over this campground and the beach. Within minutes, emergency response units from towns all outside of Los Alfacas descended on the campground to try to figure out what happened and to see if anyone was still alive. But when they actually got there and saw the devastation, they couldn't believe it. The scale was almost incomprehensible. There were all these blackened, charred bodies scattered everywhere. They were all contorted from the heat, and some were even still sitting in the remains of camp chairs, like they had been instantly cooked in place when the explosions first began. Now, that was horrifying enough, what they saw up on the field. But what first responders saw down on the beach was even worse, because along the shoreline were bodies of people who had been in the water when whatever happened. And they had clearly been boiled alive. The destruction at this entire site was so complete, so total, that first responders really couldn't even begin to guess what had happened, beyond obviously some kind of explosion. That task of deciphering what happened would take investigators several days, and what they would discover was that it all came back to that fight that Francisco Imbernon-Villena had had with the younger employee before he left the warehouse. So on the day of this catastrophe, it was true that Francisco was on his way back home from the warehouse. He had left work and he was going home. But he wasn't driving a regular truck. It was not a personal truck. And also, he had one stop to make before he could actually go home for good. Francisco was a long-haul truck driver, and he was driving this specialized truck to transport some specialized cargo to its final destination. That cargo was pressurized liquid gas, which is highly flammable and very volatile. So earlier that morning, the younger employee, who Francisco was so upset that he had been micromanaging him, he had worked here for so many years, how dare he? Well, the younger employee had been warning Francisco that Francisco had overfilled his tanker. He had put too much pressurized liquid gas in his truck, which was an incredibly dangerous thing to do if he really had overfilled it, because pressurized liquid gas needs room to expand. And if it doesn't have enough room, it can explode. And that's true on a normal day, but it's even more true, even more dangerous when you're driving this cargo around on a hot day. Because heat, like external heat on the truck, will make that gas expand even more. But Francisco, he just brushed this young employee's warning off. He had years of experience and knew that drivers like him overfilled their trucks all the time. That way they can get more fuel to their destinations. And so he just assumed that, this other employee was overreacting because this never mattered. This never had any impact on anything. They just made more money. And so he just went on with his day. And everything was fine. Nothing happened to the truck until Francisco happened to be driving past that campground. At that point, the heat did cause the gas to expand past the point of no return, and it blew up. And it sent a scorching fireball that was thousands of degrees Fahrenheit through the campground that was full of people. The initial blast was over a mile wide. And that blast triggered a wave of smaller explosions from all the camper vans and the portable grills, basically all the gas cans in that mile radius, those all detonated as well. And so in the end, Francisco, along with 158 other people, largely at that campground, died from the initial explosion. And then some estimates, when you consider long-term disease, long-term health issues from this blast, they put the final death toll at as many as 243 people. One afternoon in late February of 2023, a 26-year-old man named Julio Bermejo walked toward a park in the city of Puno, Peru, with his girlfriend, Juanita. They were on the way to the park to meet Julio's two best friends, who he was finally going to be introducing Juanita to. To this point, they knew he had a girlfriend, but they had never actually met. And this in and of itself was actually kind of odd, because again, these are Julio's best friends, and Julio and Juanita had actually been together for a while now. But Julio had sort of always been a little hesitant to introduce her to his friends, because he knew, Juanita was just a little bit different. She was odd. And he knew that his friends might, pick up on that and maybe even make fun of him for it. He didn't know. He was worried that it would cause weirdness amongst the friends if they, had a chance to interact with his girlfriend. And so he just kind of kept her secret. But his friends knew he was dating Juanita, and they just really wanted to meet her. And so they kept pressuring him. And finally, he's like, you know what? We'll just go to the park. We'll meet up. I'm sure it'll be fine. And in order to ensure that this meeting would go as well as it could, Julio had also brought along with him as they're walking to the park, he had this big red cooler. And inside of it was all this rum and some cups and ice and stuff that they could drink while they're at the park. And for what it's worth, you're not allowed to drink in public in Peru. And Julio knew this. And so he was sort of weary of the fact that he's lugging this, obvious case of drinks out to a public park. And he was going to be drinking in public, but he felt like it was worth the risk. He would go out there, they'd have a couple of drinks, his friends would meet Juanita, they would all be fine. Eventually, Julio and Juanita reached the edge of the park. And up ahead, Julio could see his two friends waiting by this crumbling wall within the park. So most of Puno was covered in all these old ruins because there was this ancient civilization called the Incas who had lived there hundreds of years ago. And so this crumbling wall that his friends were sitting on was quite literally like an artifact, a remnant of the past. But it was sort of so commonplace in this area that people didn't even notice them. It was just sort of part of the landscape. And so Juanita and Julio's big red cooler full of rum, they lumbered their way through the park, dodging different, ruins that were jutting out of the ground, all the way over to the wall where the two friends were. And they actually hadn't seen them approaching. And so it was only when they kind of just were standing right in front of them that the friends looked and saw Julio, saw Juanita. And Julio, right away, he's sort of trying to gauge their reaction to Juanita and to this whole situation. But pretty quickly, his friends were, just pretty cool. And they were interested in Juanita. And, they quickly wanted to learn more about Juanita. And it was just like kind of easy. And Julio, he opened up the cooler right away. He got the cups out. He's filling them up with rum and soda. And all the friends are drinking. They're having a good time. And Julio's like, man, I was worried about nothing. My friends, they think Juanita is great. Yeah, she's different, but they think she's great. This has gone as well as it could have. And also, definitely the rum was helping. And so for a while, all four of them were just sitting around this, crumbling wall, drinking their rum. They're having a good time. And then at some point, Julio, who was facing his two friends, his friends, they sort of looked up and they had this look come over their face like they were worried about something that clearly was behind Julio. They sort of gasped when they saw it. And Julio, he's like, oh no, like, is it the police? Because they're out here drinking publicly and they're getting a little bit drunk and a little bit rowdy, with the exception of Juanita. She had drank the least of the group, perhaps to maintain some level of decency, perhaps. But, the two friends and Julio, they were pretty drunk and being loud. And so Julio, he turns around and his stomach just drops because, yep, here come the police. There are two officers coming over and he's thinking, the jig's up. They're going to clearly see that we are drinking in public. We can't even hide it. And so the officers, they walk over and, the friends are sort of panicking. They're putting their cups down. And Julio, he's just sort of resigned to his fate here. He's going to get in trouble. And the officers, they come over and they see the cups and they can clearly tell this group of people is drinking. But when they looked into that red cooler, that big red cooler that Julio had brought along, when they saw what was in there, they backed up and they told Julio to stay right where he was. So Julio and Juanita had actually been together for years. And despite his insecurities about her, about their relationship, he was ultimately pretty eager for his friends to finally meet her. But taking her to the park that day turned out to be a really big mistake. Because when the police arrived on the scene and they looked in Julio's red cooler, probably expecting to see alcohol, because that's very likely why they approached them in the first place, they did see alcohol, but they also saw Juanita. So Julio was right to be on edge about how his friends might react to seeing his girlfriend, seeing Juanita, because she was so different, right? That's his concern. And she was very different than your sort of average girlfriend, let's say. Because Juanita was actually an 800-year-old mummified man from the pre-Hispanic era, the period when the Incan civilization ruled the area. Julio's father had acquired Juanita, this mummy, decades ago. So Juanita had actually been a fixture in Julio's life since he was born. Now, Julio's best friends, really all of his friends, knew that, his family had this mummy, but they didn't take it seriously when Julio referred to the mummy as his girlfriend. Again, this is an 800-year-old mummified man, that he calls his girlfriend. They thought it was a joke. But, when it seemed like it wasn't a joke, when it seemed like Julio apparently had a real relationship with this mummy, the friends begged him to bring Juanita out. They wanted to see this amazing artifact. But they didn't realize that request, when they finally pushed Julio to come out to this park with Juanita in his cooler, because that's how he transported her, that would actually destroy their friend's actual love life. Because Julio was not joking when he called Juanita his girlfriend. He had very real, very deep feelings for this mummy. He'd even convinced himself that she was like an active participant in their relationship and sort of kept him in line, according to Julio. He said that Juanita would hold his hand and would poke his feet whenever he misbehaved. And so, when those two officers in the park came over to Julio and his friends and they looked in the cooler, they saw, Juanita, this mummy, partially inside of this cooler along with the rum. And so right off the bat, Julio and his friends, they're getting in trouble for that alcohol. But also, Julio was arrested and charged with the illegal possession of a historical item. But as of 2023, there's been no update on this case. As for Juanita, like the actual mummy, it was confiscated by the Ministry of Culture for research purposes, and that means very likely that she and Julio will be separated forever. This episode is sponsored by AG1. Wherever summer takes you, whether it's Hawaii or the Grand Canyon or somewhere in between, bring your routine with you and count on AG1 to support your overall health along the way. My schedule can be very unpredictable, especially when I travel, and so healthy habits are usually the first thing to fall off. That's why I appreciate having one simple thing I can take with me and do every day without overthinking it. Since adding AG1 to my daily routine and also specifically my travel routine, I've noticed that I feel more energized. And I really like knowing that I'm supporting my overall wellness, all without having to juggle a bunch of different supplements. AG1 makes it easy by closing nutrient gaps and supporting gut health. Just one scoop of AG1 delivers 75 plus vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients to improve digestion and support energy and immune health. And the key nutrients in AG1 Next Gen were shown to be quickly and easily absorbed into the body. Get a free AG1 travel kit featuring 7 travel sticks and a travel case added to your welcome kit with your first AG1 subscription order. One afternoon in 1984, a man named Dmitry carried a cardboard box down the hallway of this high-rise apartment building in the city of Kramatorsk, Ukraine. And this building was basically brand new. It was one of a bunch of developments that had been built right before the Moscow Olympics just 4 years earlier in 1980 as part of a push to show the world that the Soviet Union was a very successful and prosperous place. So very much by design, everything that they had built was very shiny and very modern and impressive, like this apartment building. And pretty much everybody in the area had been really desperate to get one of these new apartments. And Dmitry had lucked out. So a few weeks ago, Dmitry had been notified that one of the units had suddenly opened up, and he jumped at the opportunity to move in. He and his family had never lived in a place this nice before. I mean, there were brand new appliances, and the building had thick concrete walls with great soundproofing, so they didn't have to listen to their neighbors chat or watch TV like they had in many other places they lived before. Like, this was a huge upgrade. So today, Dmitry and his wife and 2 sons had basically spent the entire afternoon hauling their furniture in and getting situated because they're like, we want to move in here as fast as possible. His family was inside the unit now, unpacking basically everything else, and Dmitri was bringing up one of the very last boxes. But as he headed down the hallway toward his apartment, Unit 85, he saw a neighbor open up her door right up ahead, and the neighbor looked out at him. And as Dmitri got closer to this neighbor, he noticed that this woman looked incredibly sad and just kind of tired, like life had beaten her down. She was also really pale and very thin and gaunt, and she had bags under her eyes. And she was watching Dmitri with this strange expression on her face, almost like pity for Dmitri. And Dmitri, despite this initial reaction to what she looked like, he doesn't know her, and this is his neighbor after all, so he was about to stop and introduce himself to her, but right as he was about to, she suddenly went back inside of her unit and closed the door. The whole thing was just very weird. And Dmitri, after the door had shut, he just stood there for a second, wondering if he should knock and ask the woman if there was some kind of problem, like was she okay? But in general, Dmitri was naturally kind of a quiet, introverted guy, and he very much preferred to mind his own business about pretty much everything. So he decided he would just leave the woman alone, which was pretty clearly what she wanted anyways. I mean, she's the one who shut the door and disappeared on him. So after a minute, he just walked the rest of the way down the hallway. He went inside of his unit, and he carried this cardboard box that he had lugged up here into the bedroom that his teenage sons were going to share. And when he got in there, he saw his boys were standing up on one of the mattresses, trying to hang a decorative rug on the wall behind their beds to kind of, freshen up the place. And Dmitri, he was glad to see that. It seemed like his sons were, leaning in to making this space their own. And so Dmitri, he set the box down and looked around their room. And with all their stuff there, it was already starting to feel like home. And he was sure that, despite the weirdness with his neighbor, that this has got to be the beginning of a really just amazing, new exciting chapter for he and his family. But Dmitri quickly realized that not everything in this building was as amazing as he thought it was. I mean, he'd already had that weird run-in with his neighbor, and it would turn out that was just the tip of the iceberg. Even though, his apartment and this whole building was undeniably nice and beautiful and modern, basically all of their neighbors were not nice. It was not just that one woman who appeared to be quite rude on that first day there. It was like every single person Dmitri ran into in this entire complex was quiet and sullen and grumpy and definitely not interested in talking to Dmitri. And then more than that, you have all these people that clearly didn't want anything to do with Dmitri and his family, but it was almost like all the time, the entire place was just silent. I mean, there was good soundproofing in this building, no doubt, but every time he walked down the hallway, it was just silent. Like nobody was making any noise in any of the apartment buildings. It was like this weird vibe that sort of hung over this whole place, like a sense of gloom and doom sort of persisted everywhere. And Dmitri just couldn't explain it. Like of all places to have that feeling be so present, why here? This is such a nice place. But Dmitri and his family, they stuck it out. They stayed in this apartment. And, despite how weird, it was, and it continued to be as weird as I've described here, pretty much the whole time they were there, Dmitri and his family, they tried to make the best of it. But a couple of years after they had moved into Unit 85, Dmitri's older son started feeling unusually tired and weak, sort of similar to how the people in the building all seemed to act. And at first, Dmitri thought his son was just stressed with school or his social life or something, and maybe he just needed more sleep. But his son's symptoms just kept getting worse. And when Dmitri and his wife eventually took their son to the doctor, they found out that unfortunately their son had leukemia, which is a blood cancer. Now, this was obviously a total shock to the family because, this whole time they'd been chalking it up to, he needs more sleep, right? But to find out it was something so serious, they didn't even know what to think. And on top of that, Dmitri's son, who had the leukemia, he had always been like a really active, healthy kid. So this just felt like it came out of nowhere. But now he had to undergo cancer treatment and spend most of his time resting in bed. And despite doing those things, he just continued to get worse. A few months after Dmitri's older son got sick, Dmitri was sitting inside of an exam room at the doctor's office with his younger son, who was now also sick. He had a lot of the same symptoms as his brother, so Dmitri had taken him for blood tests right away, fearing, he could have leukemia too. And so now they were waiting for the doctor to come back with those blood test results to see if that was the case. And when the doctor did finally come back into the room, Dmitri could tell by the look on the doctor's face that whatever they were going to say was going to be bad. So the doctor, he sat down and said that Dmitri's younger son did also have leukemia. Dmitri was shattered. I mean, he was in complete disbelief here. He asked the doctor, like, how is it possible that both of my children could develop the same type of cancer in the same year? And the doctor said, well, there is an answer for that. This was hereditary. The whole family had a genetic predisposition to leukemia. That afternoon, Dmitri brought his youngest son home and told his wife and his older son the terrible news. And Dmitri just couldn't help but feel incredibly guilty, like this was all his fault for passing his bad genes onto his kids. So once, everybody had begun to process the news and the sons were both in bed, Dmitri, just who didn't know what to do with himself now, he felt so terrible, he just decided to go out for a walk to clear his head. And so he did that. He went out, he walked around, and it didn't really work. He still had so much on his mind, so many bad thoughts passing through his mind. But when he got back to the building after his walk, as he approached the main entrance, he saw one of his neighbors sitting out on the steps, smoking a cigarette. It was actually that woman that he had first seen when he had moved in, the one who had poked her head into the hallway and then quickly closed the door without saying hello. Since that day, Dmitri had never spoken to her. He hadn't even tried to talk to her. Like, it was clear she didn't want anything to do with him or anyone else for that matter. And certainly tonight was not the moment he was going to go, talk to this woman. But very much to his surprise, as Dmitri, walked right past her and began walking up the steps to go inside the building, she actually turned and looked at him and just asked him, is everything okay? And Dmitri was so caught off guard by this that he found himself just suddenly, very emotionally, sort of blurting out everything about his son's illnesses and how it was all his fault. And as his neighbor listened to him, she didn't seem surprised at all by what he was saying. And when he was done talking, she didn't ask a single question about it. In fact, she just nodded her head like, yep, that's too bad, as if she knew this was already going on, even though there was no way she could have known this stuff. And so when it was clear their conversation wasn't really going to go much further than Dmitri just sort of vomiting out all this information and her nodding, and that was sort of it, Dmitri was going to go back into the building, but she stopped him. And she did ask him a question. She asked him, do you know anything about the tenants who lived in your unit before you? He said no. All he knew is that somebody had lived there, and then apparently they had left. That created the opening and he had jumped at the chance to move in. That's all he knew. And so she told him that, well, actually there's a story behind why this cleared up, why that unit cleared up. She said the previous tenants were a mother and her 2 teenage kids, and they had all died within 2 years of moving in. That's why it opened up. And they had died from leukemia. After hearing this, Dmitri couldn't help but feel like, okay, this doesn't seem like my kids got leukemia because this is hereditary. It feels like something else caused my kids to get sick that very likely is happening in my apartment. Like, how is it possible that both my kids got leukemia and the previous tenants who were in this unit also got leukemia? Like, there's no way. That's just coincidence. No way. And so Dmitri became absolutely obsessed with this idea that he was going to get to the bottom of whatever was going on inside of that apartment. And so over the next year, Dmitri made multiple serious efforts to get an inspector to come out and look at the apartment. He wanted them to check for a gas leak or toxic chemicals or something in the soil. But when he talked to building management, they just insisted that they'd already looked into all those things and everything was fine. Like, this is just hereditary. It's just coincidental, drop it. But Dmitri couldn't let it go. And he kept pushing, asking anyone he could to just try to help him figure out if there's some external factor that's causing his family to become ill. But it all went nowhere. Basically, people just started ignoring his requests, and Dmitri felt like there was nothing he could do. By 1987, only a few years after Dmitri and his family had moved into Unit 85, Dmitri's older son passed away from leukemia, and Dmitri's younger son continued to get sicker. Meanwhile, a rumor began to spread around the apartment building and also just across the whole area that Unit 85 of that apartment building must be cursed. 2 years later, on a cold morning in 1989, Dmitry came home from the hospital, where his younger son was being treated, to grab some clean clothes for himself and his wife. He and his wife were now spending virtually all their time at the hospital. It felt like they were at this point just waiting for their second son to die. That was the direction this seemed to be going. And so, of course, this is like a really miserable, awful time for Dmitry and his wife. And so when he got back to his apartment and after he got those clothes, instead of just immediately leaving and rushing back to the hospital, which was just so awful, Dmitry just wandered into his son's bedroom and just took a minute for himself. He sat down on one of the beds and he stared at that decorative rug that was hanging on the wall, which had been there since the first day they had moved in. The sons had put it up there. And when he looked back at that day, he remembered how excited and how hopeful his sons had been and how he and his wife had been for their new life here. Like, this felt like such an amazing opportunity. But that day, that move-in day, felt like a lifetime ago. Ever since then, nothing had gone the way they had expected. And so Dmitry wondered if maybe the rumor was true, that Unit 85, where they lived, maybe it really was cursed. And while he was thinking about that, something on the rug, the decorative rug on the wall, caught his eye. And so Dmitry, he got up and he walked over to this rug to get a better look. And at first, he couldn't even tell what he was looking at. But upon closer inspection, he knew something was wrong here. And it was wrong enough that he actually ran out of the room, picked up the phone, and called emergency services. So when Dmitry had moved in, he'd been so excited that he'd basically overlooked a lot of red flags. He never asked why the previous tenants would leave behind such a great apartment. Like, he didn't know it was because they died after living there for a very short amount of time. But he didn't ask. And he also didn't ask about why basically everybody on the premises just seemed so sad and lifeless all the time. Like, everybody acted that way. He never asked about it. And so ultimately, Dmitry's opinion of this place, of Unit 85 in this building, is that, you know what, there can be nothing wrong with living here. I mean, this is a modern place. Everything's so new and beautiful. Like, it has to be a safe place to live, right? But it would turn out being brand new and modern was actually what made this apartment building so dangerous. When this building was constructed, the Soviet government had been in such a rush to show off how wonderful and rich the country was in time for the Moscow Olympics that they'd made a terrible mistake. During the construction of this whole apartment building, the crew had lost a very small but very important piece of equipment. It was a capsule on a machine that measured the density of soil, which they used at the quarry where they were carving the stone that was used to build the apartments. Now, work had been paused so the crew could find this capsule. But the government also really didn't want there to be a big delay here because they wanted to show off this amazing place, in time for the Olympics. So after a week, even though the capsule was still missing, they just called off the search and resumed construction, figuring the capsule must just be somewhere in the quarry. But the capsule was not in the quarry. It ended up embedded into the stone walls of Unit 85. And this was a big problem, because that capsule contained a substance called cesium-137, which is extremely radioactive. And so for the next 8 years, the people who lived in that apartment building, in particular in and around Unit 85, were receiving constant radiation exposure. That's why all of Dmitry's neighbors seemed sad and pale and lethargic. And that's also why Dmitry's family and the family before him who had lived inside of Unit 85, it's why they got leukemia. Dmitry discovered the awful truth in 1989 when he was in his son's bedroom and he was looking at the rug hanging on the wall. What he noticed on the rug was there was what appeared to be a burn mark. And when he looked more closely, he realized that the burn was coming from the wall itself that the rug was pressed against. Like, there was something in the wall causing this rug to burn. And so not really having any idea what that was, but knowing that, something odd has been going on here, he suspected for many years, and no one's really looked. This seems really odd. I better call the authorities. Well, when he did, the authorities came out and they inspected the apartment. And when they cut into that wall behind the rug, what did they find? The missing capsule. In total, 6 people who lived in this apartment building died, and 17 more were disabled, all because of the radiation in Unit 85. However, despite that being sort of hard facts, nobody was ever held accountable for this death. On the evening of September 17th, 1896, a detective named John White dug a shovel into the ground outside of a home in Evanston, Illinois. So Detective White worked for the Evanston police, and that morning, the owner of the home that he was currently digging in front of had come in to report that he had found bones buried on his property. So White had been sent out there to see if they were human or animal. Now, White had actually already stopped by the home earlier to inspect a few of the bones the homeowner had pulled out of the ground, and his initial thought was they were likely just from a deer or some other animal, so he was not expecting this to be human bones. However, he had still come back to fully excavate this yard because this property was only a quarter-mile from the former home of the infamous serial killer named H.H. Holmes, who had been caught just 2 years earlier. And H.H. Holmes had confessed to 27 murders. But the police believed that there were dozens or even hundreds more that they didn't know about. So, if any of the bones that were found on this property were human, it was then very likely they were connected to this serial killer. And that would be a huge find for Detective White, at a time when he desperately needed a win. Because just a week ago, a reporter from the Chicago Chronicle had published a very unflattering story about Detective White, about how he had bungled a case, which had made White sort of like the laughingstock of the police force. It had been very embarrassing. But more than embarrassment, I mean, Detective White cared a lot about his reputation. He cared about being a good detective. So he had been looking for a way to sort of get that story out of everybody's heads. And he thought, like, what better way to do that than to be the detective that finds these missing bones, these potentially missing bones of these victims that had never been found. And so White, who he's out here, part of this bigger excavation of this property, he takes a shovel and he begins to dig. And at some point, he hits something hard in the ground. At that point, White took a shovel away and he reached down and he carefully brushed away the dirt from whatever he hit. And eventually, when he revealed what it was clearly bone, but more than that, it was clearly human bone. It was an entire human skull. And so White, he was thrilled. This is like, in some ways, the best thing he could have found. This is undeniably human remains here. And that was sort of what he was hoping he would find. And there also wasn't much decay or discoloration on the skull, which suggested it had not been buried for very long, at least not more than a few years, which also highly suggested it was connected to H.H. Holmes, who had been caught 2 years ago. And so White, he's feeling really good. Like, he's got the big find here. This is exactly what he hoped would happen. He knew the medical examiner would obviously have to look things over and confirm some things, but it certainly seemed like he had effectively struck gold. And it also seemed like this was going to be White's chance to really stick it to that reporter who just a week earlier had written that horrible article about him. Now look at White. Look what he was doing now. Nobody would remember that terrible article, and everybody would remember this. And so White, he stops digging, he wraps the skull in a blanket, and he heads back to the police station. And when he went in there, who was already inside talking to another officer? None other than that very reporter who had written that embarrassing article about White a week earlier. And so White, he's thrilled. Like, this is the best case scenario for him. He's got that skull that's wrapped in a blanket. And he made a point of, as he walked down the middle of the aisle of this big room full of all the other officers and desks and this reporter, he made a point to really indicate that he had something important in his hands and he was walking with a purpose here. But he really wanted to get the reporter's attention. And so he walks down the aisle, he's got his skull, and the reporter, he notices and stops what he's doing. And he turns and he looks at White and he's like, "Hey, what do you got there?" And so White, he turns to this reporter and, he stares at him like, "I know who you are. I know what you wrote about me." But what he does is he unfurls the blanket and reveals the human skull to the reporter. And the reporter's looking at it like, "What in the world?" And White's like, "Yeah, he's kind of gloating as he's doing this. He's like, "Yeah, I was digging up over at that property about a quarter mile from where H.H. Holmes lived. And I think I found another victim, a victim that nobody knew about. Yep, here it is. So there you go." And the reporter, he's staring at the skull. He's hearing what Detective White has said. And White could see the gears are turning in the reporter's head. Like, this is a huge story. And the reporter's like, "Oh my goodness, like, thank you. I got to write about this. This is amazing. I can't believe you've found this. This is incredible." And so White's like, this is the greatest thing. He's going to write a new article. It's going to feature me. I'm going to be the hero. And also, how great is it that this article is going to be written by him? Like the same guy who talked bad about me is now going to make me out to be some kind of a hero. This is perfect. The next morning, when White walked into the police station, he was greeted with all his fellow officers cheering and clapping for him, congratulating him on this huge breakthrough, the find of this skull. So that Chicago Chronicle reporter had immediately written a story about White's big find, about finding the skull in that yard, and it had been front page news that morning. And so all of White's colleagues, everybody had read this story. He was the star. And to White's delight, the reporter even openly speculated that that skull might even belong to H.H. Holmes's former wife, Minnie Williams, who'd completely disappeared a few months after they had gotten married, which was a huge revelation because nobody knew what happened to her. And it was like, wow, Detective White, you figured it out. You found her. And so Detective White had like the best day of his life. Like, this is redemption. Everything is great. Until that night, on his way home from work, Detective White stopped at this very crowded newsstand to pick up a copy of the evening edition. He grabbed a newspaper off the shelf and he looked at the front page, and unsurprisingly, his story, the Bones story, was still very much front page news. But as he read through the article, his stomach dropped. And then he heard a noise coming from all around him that made his blood run cold. It would turn out, other than the human skull that White dug up on that property, all the other bones that so far had been found on that man's property had been horse bones. And more than that, the skull did not belong to a murder victim. So, unfortunately, White's big breakthrough was not a breakthrough at all. But Detective White, he actually knew that. He had known that from the first second he stepped on that property. Ever since that embarrassing article had been published about White that week earlier, he'd become obsessed, not just with fixing his reputation, but specifically with getting revenge on that reporter who wrote it. And this bone scenario had given him, in his mind, the perfect opportunity. He had come up with this elaborate plan to plant the human skull, pretend to find it, and then tell that specific reporter all about it, in hopes that the reporter would write a completely incorrect story and then get publicly humiliated, exactly the way White felt like he had been humiliated. But White had underestimated this reporter, because the reporter, after seeing the skull that White showed him and writing that big article about how this skull could be connected to H.H. Holmes, the reporter, he gets that story out the door that morning. It's this big hit. After that, on that same day, the reporter went to the medical examiner to ask for more information about the skull. And quickly, he learned about the other bones, and he learned that this skull very likely was not connected to H.H. Holmes. And the reporter began to see that this looked like a setup. He saw through White's scheme. And so that evening, a whole new article had come out about White and his big discovery. And basically what it said was White was a petty moron who tampered with evidence and thought he could pass off horse bones for human ones. And so White, after reading this story and realizing what a terrible position he was in now, that sound he heard all around him that made his blood run cold was the sound of the other people all around him reading this article and laughing at his expense. One evening in 1890, a young man named Tadeo Fulgencio Mejia laid in bed inside of this big, expensive mansion that he'd recently bought in Guanajuato, Mexico. And Tadeo was feeling really miserable because he was sick with a fever. And so he rolled over and he let out this long, agonizing sigh, and then he heard his wife, Maria, come into the room. And he looked up and he saw that she had a cup of tea in her hand, and she walked over and she set it on his bedside table. And even though Tadeo, he really felt physically terrible, it was like the instant his wife was right next to him, taking care of him, just her presence, it made him smile. Now, Tadeo and Maria had actually only recently gotten married, but Tadeo was like head over heels in love with her. She was smart, she was fun, she was very caring, she was beautiful. And so far, their life together, despite it being relatively short so far, had gotten off to a really nice start. So Tadeo had not been born wealthy, but he had worked his way up to becoming a very successful mining engineer. And then after becoming very wealthy and successful, he had met Maria, fallen in love with her. They'd gotten engaged really quickly. And Tadeo had actually bought her this huge mansion they were in right now as a wedding present. And this mansion, this home, really was ideal for both of them, not just because it was a beautiful, grand home, but also because the town it was in, Guanajuato, was where Tadeo worked. And it was also where Maria's whole family lived, so it was perfect. Plus, the neighborhood was clean, it was quiet, it was safe, and the neighbors, for the most part, were all also upper-class professionals, just like Tadeo. So they fit right in. So for Tadeo, his amazing wife, his big house, and his nice neighborhood, those all felt like symbols of his great success. So, on this night, although Tadeo did obviously feel very sick, he also felt really proud and very satisfied with his life. And so right after his wife sat down next to him on the bed, Tadeo sat up, he smiled at her again, and he grabbed the tea she had brought for him, and he took a sip of it. And then Maria, she smiled back at him, but then she looked at him with an almost apologetic look on her face and said that, she did have to go right now, or she was going to be late for dinner with her family. And when she said this, Tadeo felt a little bit uneasy. So Maria went to her family's house for dinner a lot, since they lived walking distance away. But normally, Tadeo physically walked her there. Because to get to her family's house, Maria had to leave their safe neighborhood where they lived and pass along a couple of sketchier streets. And so Tadeo was always concerned that if she was walking in those areas without him, that she might get mugged or attacked or something. She was vulnerable. But Tadeo clearly was just way too sick to walk her that night. And so he told her that he was really worried about her going alone, but Maria sort of brushed him off and said, everything was going to be just fine. Then she leaned over, she gave him a kiss, and she said goodbye. And then she got up, she grabbed her handbag, and he watched her leave. A few hours later, Tadeo was still in bed, sort of half asleep, when he heard these sudden, frantic knocks at his front door that didn't stop. Somebody was banging on his door over and over again. And Tadeo's first thought was that it must be Maria. But Maria obviously had a key to their house, so he didn't know why she'd be knocking. But the knocking sounded so panicked that he immediately felt like something must be wrong here. So even though Tadeo was very groggy still and quite feverish, he leapt out of bed and rushed to the door and flung it open. But when he looked outside, he didn't see Maria. He saw a small group of his neighbors, and they all seemed really freaked out, like something had happened, clearly. And one of them actually looked at Tadeo with tears in her eyes, and she said that Tadeo needed to come with them. Just minutes later, Tadeo was led over to the entrance of this alleyway that was right outside of his nice, quiet neighborhood. And over here, there were all these people that had sort of swarmed around the entrance to this alleyway. And as soon as he got there, Tadeo could see that the alleyway itself was swarming with police. And so Tadeo, he pushed through the crowd because he's starting to panic, like, what's going on here? Where's Maria? He gets through the crowd and he looks into the alleyway. This is his first unobstructed view. And it's very clear that in the middle of the alleyway, something's on the ground. And when police sort of stepped out of the way, he could tell what was on the ground was his wife's body. Maria had been stabbed in the back, and she was now lying face down on the pavement, surrounded by blood. Tadeo was so shocked and still so feverish that it's like he couldn't even process what he was seeing. I mean, it all seemed like this just had to be fake or something. Like, this can't be real. So when a police officer came over and asked Tadeo if he was the victim's husband, all Tadeo could do was just slowly nod and just stare at his wife's body. And then, at some point the officer asked him, like, where were you tonight? Do you have any idea what happened to your wife? But Tadeo, it's like he was hearing these words, but just couldn't process it. And so he didn't say anything. He just continued to nod and just stared at his wife. Later that night, Tadeo was back at his home, just sitting on his couch in a total daze, just shivering. I mean, he was shivering from his fever, from the sweat that was all over his body, and he was also just shivering from coming down from having this huge surge of adrenaline after seeing his wife dead in the alleyway. But more than anything, he was just like frozen. I mean, he could barely remember even getting back to his house. And so now he just like sat there, like he had no idea what he was going to do. But eventually his body became so exhausted that he just shut down, he keeled over on the couch, and he just passed out right there. And at some point in the night, Tadeo began having this horrifying fever dream. In this dream, Tadeo was looking out the window from his living room and he could see Maria. and she was stumbling down the road, and there was this huge trail of blood behind her, and she was screaming for Tadeo to help her. And then suddenly Tadeo woke back up again, and he found himself sitting on the couch, and he sort of took stock of where he was. He realized that was just a dream, and then he realized he was drenched in sweat and his heart was racing. Like, that dream felt so real. But then as he was just sitting there in stunned silence, just sort of processing that that really was a dream, he heard something that immediately gave him goosebumps. He could hear somewhere in the distance the sound of his wife's voice calling his name. Over the next few days, Tadeo's fever went away, but his fever dreams, or his nightmares he was having about his wife calling out for him, those didn't stop. And every once in a while, when he would wake up from one of these horrible nightmares, he would again hear the sound of Maria calling to him. And it was like always so clear. He knows he's awake again. He knows he's not dreaming anymore, and he would hear her voice. He was certain it was her. But he could never tell where the sound of her voice was coming from after he would wake up from these dreams. He couldn't tell if she was calling from outside the house or inside the house, or if it was just in his own head. But it didn't matter. I mean, every time it felt so real. Like, that was not a part of the dream. That was real life, and it was terrifying. At the same time that Tadeo was grappling with the loss of his wife, and he's having these terrible nightmares, and he's trying to like pick the pieces of his life back up and put them back together, he also was going to the police to try to get more information about what happened to his wife. Like, what did they find in the alleyway? Like, who could have done this? What happened? But unfortunately, the police really hadn't learned much so far. They didn't know who did this, they hadn't found a murder weapon, and they told Tadeo that when they found his wife's body, she didn't have any personal belongings near her. And Tadeo said, well, she should have had her handbag. She left the house with her handbag. She should have had it with her. And so the police said, well, no, it wasn't there. So maybe what this is just a robbery gone wrong. And they took her purse and they killed her in the process. Now, Tadeo didn't doubt that that could have been what happened to his wife. I mean, one of his chief fears about his wife walking alone in those sketchier neighborhoods was the fear that she might be attacked, she might be mugged. And so very likely that could have happened. But Tadeo wanted the police to fully investigate and figure out, like, who did this? Was it a robbery gone wrong? He wanted to know for sure who did it, find them, like, bring them to justice. He wanted answers. And the police were very committed to trying to get him those answers. But unfortunately, days turned into weeks, turned into months with no updates, and Tadeo was left feeling like, what's going to happen here? Have they forgotten about my wife? Like, is there just nothing? Like, is no one going to be held to account for what happened? And so after a few months of just relative silence and just feeling like he can't move on with his life without some sort of closure here, Tadeo found himself feeling overwhelmed by really three emotions. There was grief over the loss of his wife. There was anger at what he viewed was just ultimately police incompetence or police, laziness or deprioritization of his wife's case. And guilt, because in a way, he did feel responsible for his wife's death. If he had just sucked it up and, despite being sick, walked her to her family's house, maybe he could have protected her. Also, he thought about the fact that he was the one who bought this house. And so in virtue of putting her here, she had to walk that route to see her family. And so in that way as well, he jeopardized her safety. He sort of pushed her into the environment where she was killed. And so he was feeling really, really guilty. And so because of all these horrible feelings Tadeo was feeling, combined with still no word on who actually did this to his wife or why, Tadeo felt like he was basically losing his mind. He stopped going to work and instead just spent all hours basically sitting in his living room, staring out the window. It was like there was some part of him that thought if he just waited long enough, he would see Maria walking down the street towards him, calling out to him like he had seen her so many times in his nightmares right out this window. And at the same time, Tadeo more and more was convinced he could hear the sound of Maria calling out to him, basically at all hours. Whether he had just come out of one of those awful nightmares, which he was still having, or if it was just the middle of the day and he's just sitting there looking out the window, like not asleep at all, he would still hear her voice. Didn't know if it was inside the house, outside, in his head, he didn't know, but it was like she was constantly on his mind, either because he was waiting to see her out the window or he was waiting to hear her. It was like all-consuming. Maria was the only thing he thought about. And eventually, Tadeo began to believe that the reason he was feeling the way he was feeling was not just overwhelming grief. Like, The dreams he was having, the nightmares, like hearing his wife calling to him at all hours and believing he was going to see her out this window. But that wasn't grief. That in fact, it was his wife's spirit contacting him. That she was basically telling him that she cannot rest until her murder is solved. And Tadeo, when he realized that that was what was going on from his perspective, he realized that he had to take matters into his own hands. He needed, for the sake of his wife, to solve her murder so she could finally rest. And so Tadeo, he retraced his wife's steps, he interviewed his neighbors, he searched all over town for her handbag and for the knife that was used to kill her. But despite how motivated he was to try to solve this thing and do right by his wife, he didn't uncover anything new. There was no new leads, no new evidence, no clues, nothing. It was one dead end after another. However, over the course of Tadeo's investigation into his wife's death, one thing did become increasingly clear, and that was Guanajuato was not nearly as safe as everybody thought. First, a drifter passing through Guanajuato was kidnapped. Now, nobody really connected this to Tadeo's wife's murder, at least not at first, because this person who went missing, they were never found. And so it was not really clear what happened to them, wasn't clear if they were killed, there was no clear overlaps between this person and Maria. And so at first it was just this thing that happened in Guanajuato and nobody connected it to Maria. But then about a week after that person got kidnapped, another woman who lived on the outskirts of town, she disappeared. And then just days after that, another man went missing. Now in each of these 3 new disappearances, none of them were found. They literally just disappeared, and that was it. Nobody knew what happened to them. But, as Tadeo is out there talking to people and trying to figure out what's going on with his wife, more and more people in town began to say, this is not a safe place. What if there's a serial killer on the loose here, and your wife could have been the first victim? And now they're refining their methods, and they're taking people away, and they're killing them, and they're not even being found. That was the consensus in town. And so Tadeo, he's hearing this new theory about a crazed killer from the people in town, and he's still continuing his own investigation, but it's basically going nowhere. The police are still not giving him anything. They're continuing their own investigation. They're hearing about this killer theory, but that's going nowhere. And so basically Tadeo didn't know what to do. He felt like there's a whole lot of things that could have happened, but nobody really knows. However, he wound up having a conversation with a very unlikely person just a few days after that third person went missing. And this conversation inspired a brand new approach for how Tadeo would figure out what happened to his wife. It was an extreme idea, one that he certainly hadn't thought of himself, but as soon as he heard it, he felt like, this is what I gotta do. The next day, Tadeo walked down a residential street in Guanajuato towards the sprawling, beautiful, expensive-looking home. His heart was racing, so to calm himself down, he put one hand into his pocket, and he felt the cold metal of the gun that he had brought along. So after his conversation the day before with this unlikely person, Tadeo had completely changed his investigative approach. And now he was fully convinced that he was right on the cusp of finding his wife's killer, and that the answer was actually inside of this very expensive-looking home. That's why he'd brought the gun. And it was also why now he went up to this house and he turned the front doorknob, and he found it was unlocked, just like he knew it would be. Then, without knocking or announcing himself at all, Tadeo walked inside of this house, he shut the door behind him, and he went directly to a staircase that led down to the basement. And standing at the top of these stairs, Tadeo felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He was so scared that he almost wanted to turn around and run out of the house. But he was also so grief-stricken and so desperate that he felt like this was the only way he would ever find the truth. So he took a deep, steadying breath, and then he walked down the stairs. And what Tadeo saw in the basement looked like a scene out of a horror movie. It was almost completely dark down there, except for some flickering light from a couple of tall black candles. On one side of the room, from what he could see, there was what appeared to be several mangled human bodies stacked up in a pile. And on the other side of the room was like this bizarre occult altar. And on this altar, there was a long knife, some kind of a book, like a spell book, and a chalice that was filled with human blood. And then also painted on the wall above this altar was a red pentagram that clearly had been drawn in blood as well. And so Tadeo, he just stood there for a moment, staring at the bodies, staring at the altar, the pentagram, and it was just quiet for a moment. And then there was the sound of a single gunshot. It didn't take long for the police to show up at this beautiful residence after a neighbor had reported hearing that single gunshot coming from inside. Officers pounded on the door, and when nobody answered, they just went inside. And once inside, the police found the home was very quiet, very still. They looked around on the whole first floor, but they didn't see anything unusual. But then one of the officers found a staircase that led down to the basement. And so down they went. And when they reached the basement, they saw the same horrible scene that Tadeo had. I mean, it basically is like this occult lair down there, complete with bodies and blood and altars and all this terrible stuff. But there was something else in the basement that the police saw that Tadeo did not. So it would turn out that when Tadeo began his own investigation into his wife's death, when he began hitting one roadblock after another and he's not learning anything and it just feels like one big dead end. Well, when that happened, he was so frustrated but so determined to know what happened to his wife that he turned to a local witch and he asked them, "Hey, is there any way for me to contact the dead directly? Like, can I talk to my wife and have her just tell me who killed her? I have to know who killed her. Like, can you do that for me? She's already whispering to me. I'm already having these visions in my dreams of her. I know she's there. I just need some help. I gotta have this conversation with her." And the witch is like, "I have just the thing. There's a ritual you can follow that if you follow all the steps exactly, you can have that interaction with your dead wife and you can get the information you're seeking." And so the witch gives Tadeo this list of very specific instructions, which included human sacrifice. And Tadeo, he takes down all the instructions and then he sets out trying to perform this ritual. He goes out and he kidnaps that drifter, the first person who went missing from town. Tadeo kidnapped them and did kill them for this ritual. But after following all the steps, Tadeo didn't get to talk to his wife. She didn't appear. She didn't tell him who murdered her. And so what does Tadeo do? He goes out and kidnaps somebody else in town, that woman on the outskirts of town. He kidnaps her. He kills her for ritual number 2. But again, despite following all the steps, he couldn't contact his wife. It didn't work. And so he goes out again. He kidnaps that man and he kills him. And he performs the ritual for a 3rd time and it still doesn't work. And so what does he do? A few days after that 3rd person disappeared and everybody in town is freaking out about a serial killer because there actually was one, it was Tadeo. He speaks to the witch again and says, "Hey, your instructions aren't working. What do I gotta do to talk to my dead wife here?" And the witch says, "Well, there's one other way you can perform this ritual. You can be the sacrifice." And Tadeo, he's thinking, this is pretty extreme, but I want to figure out what happened to my wife. And so Tadeo, the now known serial killer, wanders into his own house. His house was the big, beautiful house, into the basement of his mansion where he was keeping the bodies of the people he was killing. And he had his ritual he performed on the altar. And he goes down there and he ritualistically kills himself in order to connect with his wife. And so he shoots himself and he dies. And then the police show up a little bit after. They come into the basement. They see this horrible scene. And what they saw that Tadeo didn't was his dead body in the middle of the floor. And so in the end, Tadeo literally became a murderer. He killed 3 people. He ended his own life, all in an effort to try to figure out what happened to his wife. And what happened to his wife is it actually was just random. It was a robbery gone wrong. On the night of April 2nd, 1899, a cowboy named Charles Casimir rode his horse through a blizzard near Lyman County in South Dakota. He was following another cowboy named Frank Heppa, who was also on horseback. So Charles and Frank were both employees at this large ranch, where typically they would work with a big team. And they had come out here with a big team, but they'd gotten separated from the rest of their group while tracking down some missing cattle. And so now they were looking for somewhere to take shelter from this huge storm, which had sort of come out of nowhere. And Charles was terrified as he rode through the storm. but not because of the storm itself. I mean, he had ridden through any number of big storms in the past. He was a rugged guy, and even though this storm was quite bad, that wasn't what was making him so fearful. What really bothered him, what really unsettled him right now, was the fact that he was out here just with this guy Frank by himself. He was like the last person he wanted to be around alone. So 5 years ago, Charles knew that Frank here had been charged with murder for brutally killing his business partner over an argument about money. Now, Frank had gotten off by claiming self-defense, but as Charles had heard it, that was pretty much impossible, and he just couldn't understand how Frank had gotten away with it. Because Frank's partner, the guy who had been killed, had literally been stabbed in the back. So how is that self-defense? So ever since Charles had heard the story about one of his coworkers, he'd avoided working one-on-one with Frank. And fortunately, most of the time he was in a big group, and so even if Frank was a part of that group, he was never isolated with him. But the snowstorm had thrust Charles into sort of a worst-case scenario. Bad storm, isolated with a potential killer. And on top of that, because of how bad the visibility was in the storm, Charles didn't even know where they were. I mean, he was lost. But as he was riding along behind Frank, despite all the issues he had with him, he did appear to know where he was going. And so Charles, he didn't want to freeze to death out here, so he ignored his fears and continued to follow Frank. And for a while, that's just how it went. Frank leading, Charles following, in relative silence, like not much communication between them, the storms blowing all around them. And then eventually, Charles started to notice that his horse seemed to be getting really tired. And like that would be a really big problem if his horse couldn't continue. And it didn't appear like they were near any structure or any landmark or anything. I mean, Charles doesn't know where they are. Again, Frank appears to have a sense of where they're going. But right as Charles was really starting to get worried about his horse basically not being able to make it, suddenly this structure sort of appeared out of the darkness up ahead of them. They really needed to get out of the storm or else they could freeze to death. And so this was life-saving. But that also meant that Charles now would not only have to be alone with Frank, but he'd have to be alone with Frank inside of a small space. And so even though Charles knew he couldn't turn this down, he had to go or else he could die, it was like, with a lot of reservation, they go inside of this building. A half an hour later, Charles was stoking a fire inside of the shack's fireplace and was waiting for the place to heat up. But already it was so much better than being out in the storm. And so as Charles is sort of looking around and Frank's getting his gear together on the side of the shack, Charles noticed that there was lots of dust built up on everything, suggesting that nobody had been in here for a long time. This was maybe an abandoned place, he didn't know. However, when he made a comment to Frank about that, saying, how lucky it was they found this place, this rundown, abandoned place, Frank corrected him and said, actually, no. Luck had nothing to do with it, and this is not really an abandoned place. Frank said the reason he knew this house would be here is because he used to live here. At first, Charles was like, oh, that makes sense. That's why Frank knew where he was going. That's how he was able to navigate the storm and get us here, because he used to live here. And so at first, Charles is like, oh, cool, that makes sense. But then he's thinking, wait a minute. I know that, Frank's business partner, who Frank killed, whether it was self-defense or just premeditated murder, clearly Frank did do the killing of his business partner. It happened, apparently, according to the story, inside of Frank's house. And Charles is looking around at the dust on everything inside of here, and he's thinking, wait a minute, clearly Frank hasn't lived here recently, and he's saying he used to live here. Is it possible that this shack is where the killing happened? Is this where Frank killed his business partner, this small space? And at this point, he looks over at Frank, who's now sitting on a stool by the fire, and he's eating some beans out of a can, and he's sipping some whiskey from his flask, acting totally unbothered about potentially being in the exact space where he killed somebody, potentially. And Charles, it was like he had these spiraling thoughts of fear. Like he's looking at this guy who he doesn't want to be around. He's in a place where maybe he's killed someone, and it was like too much. He became completely overwhelmed and just knew he had to go. He had to go out of the shack and just get away from Frank. He didn't even care that there was a storm raging outside. He just had to get away. And so really, without coming up with a plan at all, Charles just looks over at Frank and he's like, I'm going to go outside and get a breath of fresh air. And then before Frank could say or do anything, Charles just turned around and walked out the door out into the storm. Now, once Charles was outside, despite the storm raging all around him, he immediately felt a sense of relief, because, anything was better than being inside of that horrible place with that horrible person. And so he began walking over to the horses just to check on them, and again, just kind of collect his thoughts and just kind of center himself before he figures out what he's going to do next. And he's walking over to the horses, and as he's about to grab the first horse, he hears something behind him. The next day, not far away from the shack, a couple of ranchers were fixing a fence that had been damaged by the big storm when they spotted a cowboy off in the distance who was on horseback riding through the snow. And the cowboy, it looked like something was wrong with him, like he was very weak or something, because he was kind of slouching to one side like he might fall off his horse at any moment. So the ranchers got on their own horses and they rode over to him, and when they pulled up alongside of him, they thought, we were right to come over here because this guy is a mess. His lips were blue, his eyes were wide, and he was just staring off into the distance like he was in some kind of shock. And so quickly, the ranchers pulled this guy off the horse, they wrapped him in a blanket, and after a couple of minutes, that look of shock on his face began to fade, and color returned to his face, and they gave him some of their hot coffee, and after a minute or two, this guy began to talk. However, when they asked him, what happened? Why are you out here? What's going on? All the man would say is that he wanted to bring them back to the shack where he had spent the night before, because apparently something really bad had happened inside. And so eventually this guy, this cowboy, climbed back on his horse, and he began riding back in the direction of the shack, and the ranchers followed along. And pretty soon, as they were getting closer to the shack, the ranchers began to look at each other with these kind of worried looks, because they realized what shack he was likely bringing them to. They knew that shack. So these ranchers had lived in this area for years, and 5 years ago, they had helped the local sheriff clean up the aftermath of a grisly murder at a nearby shack, Frank's shack. And the murder was Frank's business partner. And so these ranchers had literally seen the body of the victim, covered in blood, the knife still in his back, lying face down on the ground in front of the fireplace. And so now, as they were nearing where they knew this shack was, that's all they're thinking about. How is it possible that this guy is saying something bad happened and he's bringing us to the site of this grisly murder? It just felt really unsettling. And so sure enough, this cowboy leads these ranchers back to the very shack they know so well where that murder happened 5 years ago. The cowboy gets off and he leads them inside, and the ranchers, they're looking at each other what are we gonna find inside of here? What's going on? And they walk into this little space, this little shack, and they can't believe what they're looking at. It was the most intense, really awful deja vu. On the ground, in the middle of this cabin, lying face down with the head near the fireplace, was the body of a man covered in blood with a knife plunged into his back. And so the ranchers, they look at the body, and then they look over at the cowboy who's led them here and shown them the body, and he's not putting up any sort of fight. And the ranchers, they put their hands on their guns and they look to the cowboy and they're like, who did this? Were you the only one here? Was anybody else here last night? What happened? And the cowboy, all he said was, no, it was just me. I was the only one here besides, him. And so the ranchers at this point, they didn't even know what to do. So they just walked over, they grabbed the cowboy who didn't resist. They tied him up, they brought him outside, they put him on one of their horses, and they brought him back to town, and they handed him over to the sheriff and said, he's a murderer. 2 months later, in June of 1899, a grand jury met to discuss this case, and they were immediately struck by just how closely the facts in this case matched the case from the stabbing 5 years ago. The details were basically identical. You have two cowboys who walked into this particular cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and then one of them turns up dead with a knife in his back. Just, it happened on 2 separate occasions, 5 years apart. However, there was one major difference between the first instance and the second instance. This time, in the second instance, the dead man was Frank Hepa himself. The very man who had been the killer from the first case was the victim in the second case. The cowboy that the ranchers had found, who was on death's door with blue lips, who led them back out to the cabin, that was Charles. And so today, during this grand jury hearing, when Charles took the stand, the jurors were expecting him to say that yes, he had stabbed Frank, because who else could have done it, but that it was very likely done in self-defense. That was their expectation of what he would likely say. because it was really the only explanation Charles had that might get him off the hook. But when Charles spoke, he did not claim self-defense. Instead, he told a story that was arguably the least believable defense he could have possibly given. He said on the night that Frank was killed, he had panicked because he had realized he was inside of the very shack where very likely this guy had stabbed to death his former partner, and he was just so frightened by the whole experience that he decided to go outside, get a breath of fresh air, to just get away from Frank for a second. And Charles would say, he didn't even have a plan. He didn't know if he was going to come back in or if he was going to leave. There was obviously a storm going on. But he said he left the cabin, and he knows Frank is the only one inside of the cabin at this point. Charles goes outside, he's making his way over to the horses, and as he's about to grab that first horse, he hears something behind him, and he says he thinks it's Frank, and he whips around, but there's no one there. There's no one outside. However, he notices in the window of this shack, this cabin where he's just come from, he sees what looks like a shadow moving near the window. And then he hears loud commotion inside of the cabin. He knows Frank's alone in there, but he doesn't know what's going on. And so he runs back over to the cabin just out of curiosity. He opens the door back up and he looks inside, and it's just Frank. But Frank is now face down in the middle of the cabin with his head near the fireplace, and a knife is plunged into his back, and there's nobody else inside the cabin. And immediately Charles said he felt like he knew what happened. Frank clearly has been killed by a ghost. And he was so scared, so unbelievably perplexed at what he was seeing, that in a true panic, he just turned, fled the cabin, hopped on a horse, and just started riding away with no plan. And it was only by pure luck that the next day those ranchers found him before he just collapsed and died. That was his defense. So a claim like this, that Charles, was basically saying, I didn't do it, a ghost did it, was so sensational that naturally this immediately attracted a whole bunch of media attention. And for the most part, the journalists that flocked into the area to cover this trial, they expected to hear a whole bunch of sensational testimony in addition to this initial claim. They were, expecting to hear lawyers sort of poke apart this whole story and just have it be kind of a circus in the courthouse. But that eventually, the truth would come to light that, of course, Charles, he did this. He must have stabbed Frank. Who else could have done it? It couldn't have been a ghost. And then very likely he would be found guilty, he'd be hung, and that would be that. But that's not what happened. At the very last moment, Charles was told he was free to go. The grand jury had decided they were not going to pursue charges against Charles. But this meant, at least in the eyes of the very astonished people that heard about this, that had been following this whole case, that in essence, by doing that, the grand jury was siding with Charles and basically saying, yep, must have been a ghost. That's what did it. And that just seemed so absurd that these, rational members of the grand jury, who were mostly comprised of, very practical, hardened ranchers from the area, how could they possibly really believe that a ghost did this? But that really is what they believed. That is actually the reasoning they gave for why they did not pursue Charles. They believed his story. A ghost must have killed Frank. But they have a very specific reason for believing that. There was one fact that ultimately pushed the jury to believe that. And that fact was this. 5 years earlier, when Frank stabbed his partner, whether it was premeditated or self-defense, doesn't really matter. What we do know is he definitely stabbed to death his partner. When he did that, the knife he used was taken into evidence, and it was given to the prosecution, who put it in a safe, and they kept it there for the trial. But on the night before the trial began, the knife inexplicably disappeared from the safe. And the prosecution said, no one's opened the safe. No one has access to this safe. There's no way anyone could have that knife other than the prosecution. And the prosecution is like, we didn't touch it. We did not move that knife. We have no idea what happened to it. And so basically, no one knew what happened to the knife. It just went missing, and they carried on with the trial without it. It was like, okay, crazy anomaly. It is what it is. However, the knife would turn back up again 5 years later when it was found stabbed into Frank Heppa's back. Now keep in mind, Charles didn't even know Frank when Frank was accused of murder. He wasn't even following the case. Why would he have stolen the knife from the prosecutor's safe? Or how could he? Like, Charles has no connection to this knife whatsoever. And so basically the jury was left with like, well, wait a minute. If Charles didn't have this knife and he didn't do this, is it possible that maybe the victim's ghost is the one who stole the knife in the first place and then 5 years later exacted their revenge on their killer, Frank, by killing him the same way they were killed with the same knife in the same location? Well, it's up to you if you want to believe that story, but what is the case is that line of thinking was the actual literal reason that Charles was let go. They basically said, yep, a ghost did it.